Welcome to Industry 5.0, where creativity meets technology. A series brought to you by the University of Technology Sydney, a leading university of technology with global impact. I'm Tim Harcourt and I'm thrilled to be the moderator for this exciting video episode. In today's episode, I'm joined by 4 distinguished academics from UTS. Now, I'd just like to take this opportunity to introduce our expert guests. First of all, Gerhard Habusch, Associate Professor of Finance at UTS, with expertise in corporate finance, responsible investment, and financial ethics. His research finds solutions to unethical practices in finance while exploring the impact of human behaviour on capital markets. Gerhard holds a PhD and an MBA from the University of Wyoming, has experience in private equity and buyout fund management, and is a CFA charter holder and member of the CFA Institute and CFA Societies Australia. Willa Houston is an Associate Dean of the Faculty of Science at UTS. Willa is a renowned researcher in the field of host pathogen interactions and has received funding from national funding schemes such as the RC and the NHMRC to improve diagnosis and treatment of infectious diseases. In addition to her scientific research, she has also made significant contributions to science education. Farouk Hussain is the Foundation Head of Software Engineering at the School of Computer Science at UTS. Farouk's expertise lies in the areas of software engineering, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, and he highly values practice-orientated applied research, and in the past few years has successfully secured more than $7 million across a range of different projects. Farouk has also been elected to the Australian Information Industry Association, a premium national body for IT professionals, for the 3rd year in a row. Finally, Grace Lee is the Associate Dean International at the Faculty of Law here at UTS. With over 20 years of experience in leisure education and research, Grace has made significant contributions to the field of international commercial law and dispute resolution. She's also passionate about promoting cross-cultural understanding and preparing students to thrive in a globalised world. Welcome to all of you for being with us today. I'm going to look at a number of issues that I think crosses all your research, and you can all make unique contributions to it, and perhaps there'll be a bit of collaboration and cross-fertilisation as we go. I'm going to start with Gerhard. When we look at some of the key technologies and trends with the transition to Industry 5.0, a lot of it affects the world of finance. How do you see the trends affecting the world of financial markets?
Tim, thank you very much for the question. Let me start by perhaps asking everybody here, what is Industry 5.0? Because I test drove that question yesterday with some of my first year students, and admittedly some of them were a bit puzzled. They said Industry 5.0 or 5.0. And therefore, it's probably good to look back in history and look at technological revolutions, spanning roughly about the last 250 years, starting with industrial production and machines, going over to steam and steel, and then ending up with automobiles, oil and plastic production, and eventually ending up in the information age. Those will be like 5 steps in technological revolutions. And I know that some of you are great experts at artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, connectivity, collaboration through these technologies. That's what we're right in now. But where we are is not a good plan to go forward when we want to know where we're going. And hence, Industry 5.0 is really a fantastic complement to Industry 4.0 because it switches the focus from efficiency and efficient production and value creation to societal value and the focus on the individual within a system of companies, industries, and basically as a part of this world. So hence, Industry 5.0 is basically a perfect version of 4.0, and therefore this is something we need to look at in order to understand how this can be made a reality in our world that we live in today. You ask about finance, and this is interesting because with respect to the technological revolutions, finance has always been basically the lead up to some sort of crisis within each technical revolution. For example, in the current information age world, businesses led up to a dot-com evolution and then to a crash as well. And the GFC was perhaps also a second, much bigger crash that came then. And the question is now, how can we go to this global sustainability age after now the first phase of the 5th technical revolution within Industry 5.0?
It's an interesting question, Gerhard, because do you see it as a linear progression? Because in the world of finance, where you're from, we have crashes, we have booms and busts, and often the next stage of technological advancement or institutional advancement comes from a crash. So do you think we naturally go through this linear progression from 4.0 to 5.0, or do you think it's not always inevitable?
Tim, this is an excellent question. And to be honest with you, as a natural progression, I wouldn't call any of the industry 1.0s to 5.0 a natural progression. If we really look at nature, and probably the biggest problem that the planet has, we wouldn't end up in a world where we ask ourselves how to go from 4.0 to 5.0, of course. But I think it is important to understand that provided the challenges that the world is currently facing, and some of these are expressed, for example, with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that of course UTS is also committed to and formally committed to. If we understand and realize that the planet is facing certain challenges and that humanity is facing certain challenges, then perhaps it is a good compass to start working towards solving these problems by using the resources we have. And one of the resources that makes the world go around, I shall say, that makes business go around, is capital and capital markets that obviously enable businesses to source from these and function as we know them. And the question is, if we have so much capital going around, and probably the equity number that's going around is, 90 trillion or so dollars US, can we use this capital to steer it towards good outcomes that align with the outcomes that we desire to have for Industry 5.0, which is, supporting individuals' welfare, well-being, to really focus on societal values as opposed to economic outcomes, cash, GDP.
Well, finance and capital, as you say, is the fuel that drives the capitalist economy, so it's very important. But whilst finance rushes ahead, very quickly, technology rushes ahead, we have the legal system and we have grace. So as finance and capital is rushing ahead globally and technology is advancing at a great stage, to what extent do you think the law can catch up and then safeguard things like institutions and data privacy and those types of issues? How do you see it, Grace?
It is an ongoing question. Put it in simple, where we are as lawyers in this fast-changing world. I wouldn't say lawyer is best placed at the forefront of all these changes, either in the financial industry or in the technological advancement. But very simply, with the deployment of these advanced technologies, with changes in the finance industries, all these will need to operate within the parameters set by the law and the policies. Just to give you an example, if we're talking about financial institutions, in Australia we have a long list of legal instruments that operate in that field, starting from the Privacy Act 1988 as an umbrella legal instrument that enables the government agencies and business to handle personal information. We have 2017 Privacy Amendment Act that regulates for financial industry again to notify its customers and the regulator on all data breaches. At the same time, we have a very wide range of industry standards and industry policies, starting from APRA standards, Australian Prudential Protection or Regulation Authority, regulating on data breaches and cybersecurity standards. And we have, for example, the credit card industry, card payment standards regulating how credit card operator will need to use personal information in a responsible ways. So I think with all these changes in place, the stakeholders in this field will need to be aware of the fast-changing legal landscape and will need to make sure the compliances within that environment. That is the most important part.
Do you think more and more that national legal institutions will become more international as we join trade blocs and the EU and universal standards? Or do you think that in today's world people will focus more on national institutions because they're worried about foreign investment and the impacts of personal privacy and data? So do you think the nation state will become stronger from a legal point of view?
depend on which country and which state we're talking about. People have different ideas on things like this. Some are more nationalism, some are more internationalization in the way of thinking matters like this. But to be honest, with a changing geopolitical landscape, we see a lot of challenges, especially in the recent years with COVID, with conflict regionally and internationally. These can be the factors hindering international collaboration, data sharing, putting limitations on multinational business, and even challenge the fundamental, common ground for ethical and legal standards. So it is a very important question, but I don't think we have an answer for it.
Now, we've got finance and law, but we've also got software engineering and at the cutting edge of this. I mean, in some ways, finance and law is responding to the technological changes. Now, for your software engineer, I mean, you're way ahead of the game on this. I mean, how do you see your research in artificial intelligence and the like? Where's that going to take us from a technological perspective?
Thank you very much, Tim, and I thank both Gerhard and Grace for the very insightful responses. I listened to Gerhard very keenly when he outlined what, from a finance viewpoint, the vision of Industry 5.0 is, and I agree with him entirely on that. The viewpoint that I have, or not just me, but a lot of people in software engineering or computer science, is that in Industry 5.0, the use of technology will become so ingrained, so intertwined, that we will fail to notice it. Okay. Now, please forgive me, his or her name escapes me, but someone famously said that the most profound technologies are those which we fail to notice or which disappear. Take an example of a mobile phone, irrespective of whether you are an Android user or an Apple user, it has become so ingrained with our lives that we fail to notice it as a piece of technology. And yet, I can speak for myself, I can't see my life being as productive and as efficient without that piece of technology in my hand. Okay? So the technology perspective of Industry 5.0, that is more or less the consensus in the community, is that the use of a range of different technologies will become so pervasive, so ingrained, and they will become so much automated that they will become part of us. They will be ingrained into our day-to-day lives. What does that mean? It means the use of AI, Internet of Things, robotics, the way we interact with them, the way we work with them. There wouldn't be a barrier as such. To give you an example, we use the word human-computer interaction, HCI, which is a very popular area in computer science, which talks about how machines and human beings, they interact with each other. Now, increasingly, that area is being replaced by human-machine integration. That means the blending of a human being and a machine. So with that happening, with that barrier between a machine, and I use the machine very broadly, it could be a robot, it could be a bunch of sensors, it could be an IoT device, it could be an AI algorithm in that sense. With that being gone, I think the sky is the limit for the human race to go. And again, that's for us to pursue that. In terms of research moving forward, I think software engineering, as has always been the case, will provide the foundation, the underpinning background for this work in the future.
We were going to invite the Professor of Artificial Intelligence, but he's been replaced by a robot, so he can't be with us today. Now Willow, you're a leading scientist in your field, and you've seen this enormous change in technology. How has that impacted your research in Australia and overseas?
It's been amazing, Tim, to see the change in technology and the real focus on the Internet of Things, digitisation and more automation. In terms of health and considering innovating health testing, which is where a lot of my research is focused, but then how that testing leads on to better treatments, better care and better interventions. One of the things that we're really thinking about in the context of Industry 5.0 is this next wave of we can digitise, we can automate, we can get a lot more done. But how do we bring all of society along for that? And as a scientist here at UTS, where we're really thinking about sustainability, where we're really thinking about global impact, everything we do to innovate needs to be able to be translated ideally to across the globe. And so potentially that's where Industry 5.0 and the outcomes of Industry 4.0 could actually make the biggest benefit to healthcare and improving testing. More data, more public sharing of data in a way that protects the rights of the individuals and the privacy legislations that Grace spoke about, but in a way where we can maximise that availability of data. Potentially we'll see almost like the transformation in AI in industry, we'll see a transformation in healthcare, because we'll have much better access to more information. Indeed. So we can more rapidly innovate and find solutions. But we must take that Industry 5.0 lens and bring all of society along for that if we want to make a global impact. And that's what we're trying to do in the Faculty of Science. We're trying to really focus on testing, treatments, approaches that aren't going to just fit a very niche market. We want to make a difference more globally.
So the technological advancement is very exciting, but you want to make sure that there's a safety net so everyone is covered.
I think it's core to our values at UTS, but I think globally, as we become a global population, more globalised is where I hope we're going. I think that we need to keep that in front and centre of everything we do. The more complicated that we make things, or the more expensive or boutique, the less likely that's going to actually make a difference to more people.
Can I give an example
Yes, you can.
of an industry? I wouldn't say Industry 5.0 application, but that cuts across all the different disciplines, for example, is, I'm sure we have heard the word metaverse. Okay, yes. And I can see responses from everyone in the panel. So it's a fascinating concept. Fascinating. Do we understand that? No, not really. Do we understand the legal implications and how to regulate them? Not really. Do we understand the finance side of it, except that we would perhaps be using cryptos? Not really. But again, that's the future where we are all heading towards.
Just to pick up on that, a colleague in legal practice has recently set up his law firm in the metaverse, providing legal services to clients in the metaverse. That's how far I traveled in that space. But I totally agree with you. It across all different discipline and study areas, and we are here to educate next generation of learners, and this is where they got to be operating, they got to be compete with their peers.
Just to the panel, I mean, you're all excited about the technological change. Do you all have worries about the ethical concerns? I think, Willow, you mentioned privacy, for instance.
Absolutely. I think, as we digitise everything, we automate everything, we forget that actually that data is not just sitting in that machine. In fact, we may automatically be ticking a box that data is going to many, many places, and we may start to relax as individuals when we tick yes to terms and conditions about where our data is going and what the use of that is and how safe that data is. And so for me, I think ethically understanding those choices we make as individuals, but then as a society, when we enable technologies based on that, or we enable more broad sharing of data, often with good intentions, that there are always underlying broader ethical implications that perhaps we don't even understand yet. And where the data goes in the future, we can't foresee. So there's lots of that. I think I do worry about that. I think it's something that we need to discuss as we go forward. I don't think it's a good reason not to go forward. I think we should go forward, but I think a conversation like this where we consider all the elements, the financial, the legal, the ethical, the amazing computer innovations, and then the sectors that we use it in, we have to bring those together holistically.
Building in safeguards.
Building in safeguards is a great way to say it, Tim. Yeah.
I can't agree with you more on that, Villa. I think this is where policies, laws, standards will kick in. There are, numerous challenges in this area. Half of my faculty doing researches in one way or another, looking after things happening right now and how we can better protect the ethical standards and the social justice side of that. For example, one of the challenges we see during the COVID year is the data collection for monitoring. We know how significant data monitoring contribute to disease control, outbreak detection in the early stage, and etc. But the fact that a huge amount of data has been collected, how are we store them? Can someone repurpose it? In what condition that the personal information can be used? For what purposes? Do we have mandatory consent? Do we have limitations set for the right purpose of using data? These are the challenges hasn't been sorted out. And this is exactly why we are here today, talking about, in all different disciplines, how are we making sure that people's privacy are not being breached and data security is ensured.
That's why you need a good lawyer, even in the metaverse.
Here we go.
And you know someone.
Tim, allow me to add, I'm really fascinated by, getting these views and voices from other faculties, like sensing the opportunity and, the sky's the limit for humanity. That is just something that really excites me, excites our students, because they are the future leaders in business, right? And understanding, how these developments can be benefiting, the well-being and health of people on the planet in its entirety is just magic. And of course, understanding, that fences are being put up to make sure that we're doing things safely and that, conform with, these laws that are being put in place is an important thing. Sometimes with my students, I'm getting perhaps a bit lost in the data discussion or in the algorithmic bias discussion, all these things that pertain to, the use of data, probably challenges that data has that we can, use with machines in order to do better decision making. And then sometimes I get the UN SDGs back on the screen and I say, guys, 17 problems that really are the fundamental problems of the world. Like how can we now achieve better health, better well-being? How can we achieve zero poverty, no hunger, better education around the world? Gender equality, we perhaps talk about that in a minute. So what I'm trying to say is I see the opportunity that is being shared here and I'm completely agreeing with it. And I hope that we can tame and harness this in order to really help the planet move forward and also exist going forward. SDG number 12 is climate action. The planet's cooking. If we don't do something very urgently, we don't have many 100 years anymore to waste that we can continue existing here.
We will all be cooked.
I like how you said about the UN SDGs, and climate action is quite centered to not one but at least a few of those SDGs as well. And technology, again, I come back to this one example of metaverse, could be a solution, not just a piece of the puzzle in tackling some of these problems. The issue, and I don't mean that from a problematic sense, but a fact of the matter is that technology progresses at a very rapid pace. And sometimes legal frameworks and the background and security checks are slow to catch up with the progress of technology. One of the key things that me and my group, they have been looking at, again, with this point in time in metaverse is, what are the legal frameworks that a person can work in metaverse?
Hasn't been developed yet because lawyers cannot fully comprehend what it is before the technical expert explained to us fully.
Yet at the same time, as Grace mentioned, I can mention half a dozen different businesses, more than that are successfully now are operating in metaverse. What are the financial frameworks to prevent money laundering and those things? At least to the best of my knowledge, I have not come across them.
So, you mentioned the planet cooking. Well, we did the Climate Innovation Series, putting the green back in the green and gold. As we make the transition to renewable energy, UTS provides some of the solutions to move to renewable energy. So it's not just, hey, we're cooked. When the bushfires hit, we did the Airport Economist Crisis and Recovery. It was bushfires, then it was floods, then it was COVID. But then we noticed that as people were recovering from bushfires, they were building back with renewable materials. And so we ended up doing the Climate Innovation Special because from the crises, we find ways to deal with it, don't we?
Absolutely.
So when we think about climate change, UTS is a practical university. So Gerhard and the panel, it's got to be integrated, isn't it, in finance and the law and so on. How would you see it in the financial system, Gerhard?
Great question, Tim, because obviously, Paris Agreement targets are big topics in the news, but to some people, they're not just very connected to them, aren't they? And that's where, we really emphasize in our teaching programs that, for example, sustainability, responsibility, UTS Business is a socially committed business school, just to make this very verbal here, that we allow leaders to pick up on the idea that integrity, ethical behavior, proper conduct is very important in business. And of course that means to recognize, to solve the world's problems. And now this is getting us back to Industry 5.0, to give back to society, to emphasize societal values, to basically have a civic society that is interested in having businesses around that care for people, for the planet, and for everything that allows us to exist on the planet. And hence, the integration of this is very important. And you earlier asked, Tim, about ethical behavior, the ethics of the application of these technologies. And of course, in finance, we're sitting in a dark corner sometimes, because historically, financial professionals have sometimes taken advantage of other parts of society, right? And this is exactly what the focus is, for example, in the UTS Business Finance education, to make people aware of the importance of good decision making, of the importance of not only to be legal compliant, of course, but to not always walk on the line of being perhaps compliant, perhaps at least arguably compliant, but instead really having strong frameworks to fall back onto if in doubt, for example, when tackling ethical dilemmas. And that's what the students realize gets them further in their careers too, because companies, Industry 5.0, is seeking that positive aspect into society, not only because they're all interested in just doing good, but it's also good for business, of course, and hence students have to bring that to the table. And in finance, that means you can't act like a 1980s Wolf of Wall Street when you do investments. You must account for what's currently happening in this world, and that means making sure that the environment is preserved for the futures, that people are treated properly, that is the social aspect, and that we have companies that we can rely on that do not bribe and that do not do wrong at all times, but we have strong frameworks that we can fall back on.
Yeah, we did start as a convict society, and there are a few scallywags in finance in Australia, but none of them are UTS alumni, we're happy to say. Now, you've got a big view of this, Farouk, don't you, with climate change in your field?
Yes, and again, I would like to give an example. I'm aware of a lot of brilliant research being done by a number of different researchers in UTS to combat climate change. I mean, there are a lot of researchers in science, for example, in the business school and also in the law school. But I'll just give one example where I think, and by no means this is an exhaustive list again, just giving an example to share where UTS is leading the way in the development of technology-enabled solutions to combat climate change. And that is a multifaceted problem across science, finance, and also legal frameworks as well. So one of the instruments to combat climate change or to reduce the number of emissions as mandated by the Parisian agreements is carbon credits. Now for those of you who are not aware of it, so if you purchase a carbon credit, it's like a permit to emit a certain amount of CO2, it's a ton of CO2 gases into the atmosphere. So when we go into a climate regulated world, hopefully there will be caps on all different businesses and they will trade or emit carbon within those caps. And if you are exceeding those caps, you'll have to pay your way, purchase those carbon credits, and off you go. Whenever you purchase an airline ticket, for example, you try to offset your carbon footprint by paying those extra $20, $10, $30, $40, whatever it is. Unfortunately, you see, the credibility of these carbon credits is a big question, huge question. Sitting right now here, I can take you to a web page who are selling forests in the Amazon, okay? I can pay $10, $20 and purchase a tree in the Amazon, one tree, okay? The question is, does that tree really exist? And even if it does, how many times has it been sold or resold to multiple people in the past few years? And you see, it's not just a technology problem, it's a problem that cuts across the legal frameworks, the legislative frameworks, the finance, the science. So what we have been doing we have been trying to look at this problem and develop a technology solution that can verify the originality of a carbon credit. And how do we do that? We use a range of different Industry 5.0 technologies, things like Internet of Things, sensors, AI. So when a tree is being planted there, using sensors, we capture data. We fly drones to capture information on the fly just to make sure that the tree is there and not logged by someone. And that is kept on a blockchain, so that any purchaser of carbon credit, you and I, before we purchase, I can put in that number, I can see the entire history of it. So we are making the world better in that sense by, and again, it's an Industry 5.0 solution to a very complex and multifaceted problem.
And you make a good point. You know, people in Belgium say, stop flying, just take the train. But if you're from India or Australia or China from Brazil, well, it's a bit harder, isn't it? I mean, we have to fly to go anywhere. We're an island, you know, and so some of those solutions are part of that story. And maybe it's, you know, aviation with green hydrogen.
I think in the Faculty of Science there's a big focus on clean energy technologies, and the Industrial Revolution 5.0 is a big part of that, because to innovate and to understand how we use energy, the data underpinning all of that will help us make the best investments in renewables and clean energies to drive the future. And so there's a big component of research at UTS Science, and indeed in other faculties, around how we're going to solve that problem. And energy is a really big piece of the puzzle.
Now Willow, with the climate debate, a lot of people say, believe the science. But as you know, in your infectious diseases area, in your special field, the science changes and the science is contestable. So how have you seen, climate change of the pandemic change your approach to science and policy as a scientist and a science educator?
It's a really fantastic question, Tim. And in fact, I think the pandemic is where scientists got to shine. It was a crisis. It really impacted so many people. But all of a sudden, the public had access to data. They had access to an understanding of health. We taught the public about aerosol-based transmission, and people got it. And so all of a sudden, all of us fabulous geeks that are innovating for the planet got to shine, because we got to share
Rock
that
star.
actually, that's right, it was science's time. So we got to share, and again, this was data, this was sharing, it was public communication, and it was health policy all coming together. And so the other parts of the way Industry 5.0, I think, come into the pandemic and to where this is going to take us for how we can innovate for climate change is things like the massive shift in vaccine trials. So we were in a crisis. Globally, people shared their practice. There were groups more transparently sharing data, and all of a sudden those vaccine trials, which would normally take a decade, were done, and we rolled out vaccines during a pandemic. So for me, I think Industry 5.0 enabled a lot of that. The data was available, the infrastructure was available for that high level of kind of analysis, automation, the genomic sequences, we could track the pandemic as it went. All of that is really pivoting out of Industry 5.0, because it's not just the Internet of Things, it's bringing a society along with the Internet of Things, which to me is one of the big themes that comes through in Industry 5.0. But in terms of where that's taking us now for innovation and climate change, I think that's given scientists the place. We have become a trusted voice. Again, I think we always should have been, but actually because of the pandemic, the communication about aerosols and vaccines, more and more, we've become a trusted voice. And so it's given us a way, and it's also given us pause to reflect on how we communicate as scientists. So as scientists, we need to bring the public along on that journey, and that's what worked. When we did that well, in the right context, and we didn't always do it well. When we did that well with the vaccine stories, when we did that well with the aerosol transmission, the public came along and people made a choice. And so for climate change, it's the same story. We need to share the data, but we need to do it in a way that the public can understand it, but also the public can feel enabled. If we talk about it as a scary threat and it's almost impossible, the public don't feel enabled and it's almost too hard. And so our job now is a bit like the role we played in the pandemic, where there is data, here is the evidence, but how can we share that evidence with you, and here are the solutions. And it's correct, all of our colleagues here are sharing these wonderful insights into it is individual choices, but it's also our financial choices, it's companies and business choices around the decisions they make. And in science, there's a lot of innovation. It's not just about energy, it's about the built environment, it's the infrastructure we use, it's how we preserve the environment that we have and the oceans that we have. So there are so many elements of science in this problem, and if we communicate one piece of the puzzle at a time, very carefully and in a way that the public can see that in their own words, then I think we can get everybody along in understanding the story that climate change is real, but there are solutions and there are ways that we can all come together across the sectors to actually make a difference. And the sustainability story is a huge piece of that puzzle.
I love that stuff. This is just, at the very center of, what students can be really excited about by recognizing their personal impact in this global problem and the solution we need to develop, of course, right? What is our carbon footprint on an annual basis? how much is streaming of video services, costing us in terms of CO2 emissions. We recently did a research project with a local fund manager, and they were exactly interested in that question. They said, how can we help to improve Australians' carbon literacy by showing, what our actions, what kind of impact our actions have, and also to demonstrate, for example, if we put our money into the right channels, and this is where finance now comes in again, for example, by hoping that our capital is used in a way that it is not supporting old technology, but rather new technology and sustainable technology. What kind of CO2 emission savings can we generate as individuals is fascinating, and often starts discussions that do not end, because people want to understand what am I doing is costing what.
Just to add one thing on what you're saying. This morning in the news, a lot of talk about we're acquiring the submarine ship from the USA. Such a great thing, good for national security.
Build in Adelaide. Jobs.
That's right, and also all these technologies will be used in building the ship and etc. There is a very short mentioning about the issues of how to deal with the waste of the ship after it runs the full course of its life. So it looks like, at the end of the lifespan of that ship, someone will need to dig up a very big hole somewhere in land of Australia and bury the waste underground for 64,000 years. We'll need to think about that, right? Yes, it's all good about shiny Industry 5.0. It is all good about new technology and the convenience and the sense of safety that could probably bring to us. But if we think about 64,000 years, that's a big question, that's a big decision, letting alone the investment and so forth.
And Gerhard, for you, this has been a big issue with the financial implications of climate innovation.
Of course, because many people ask, is finance finally coming, or the financial services industry is finally coming on board to help the planet now to come to the rescue, similar to, Fireman Sam and my son's hero on TV. And the answer is finance has been long on board, and the development is a United Nations, again, effort to make sure that the financial industry comes on board and helps with the problems of the environment, the problems that the people have, the social aspects, and of course governance problems. That means running companies with strong frameworks and not suffering from for example, from bribery. And if we look back, for example, into the late 80s, where the Brundtland report, commissioned by the United Nations, first basically used the sustainable development concept. From there, it has been racing towards today, basically, for example, with Kofi Annan's call in 2004 to encourage these financial services CEOs to bring these factors of the environment, the social aspect, the people aspect, and also the governance aspect into the decision-making when making investment decisions. And that really jump-started ever since 2006, where the United Nations put in place the Principles for Responsible Investments, I shall say, which in essence say, Principle 1 says, we will take into account E, environmental factors, S, social factors, and G, governance factors when making decisions. And the great news is that the majority of the world in terms of financial management has subscribed to these PRIs. So more than $100 trillion, more than around 4,000 managers at this point have subscribed to these standards. That means that finance has come on board. They have formally subscribed to the idea they must take into account not only the influence that these factors have on businesses, because that's what shareholders are interested in, but also the impact that these businesses have on the outside. We call it materiality and double materiality. And those things are important to recognize, to understand that in the world of finance that runs in the background, things have been decided, which I think in a positive way. Of course, every topic is controversial, and we understand that in the United States, legal fiduciary duties are being discussed. Do we have to incorporate E, S, and G, or is this optional? The answer shall be, of course, we must account for these, because every asset is impacted by these factors. But some American presidents may disagree with that, and we can see that in their legislation. However, generally speaking, finance is at the forefront of fighting climate change together with global organizations, I would say, because there's a significant firepower, a large amount of dry powder, so to speak, that can be deployed all over the world and hopefully being deployed towards the innovations, the sustainability, the new technologies that, when applied properly, can hopefully help us to be healthier, have a better well-being, work less, allow women and men to have longer childcare breaks in order then to have a more prosperous life, a more successful life.
When people talk, and you mentioned it, Gerhard, about diversity as objectives in finance, it can be controversial. I was just thinking about the Silicon Valley Bank. The head who was chief of risk was a diversity champion and was off doing all these things, and they had an all-women, committee of investment and so on. It's gone belly up, but there was a lot of controversy in the press about this. Do you think this is just the press jumping on something they don't like anyway and the causes are quite different? Or do you think it's something about how you present diversity? Do you make it part of your business but you keep it under the radar, or do you make it a big banner and sort of run risk that some people in the media will attack it?
It's a great question, Tim. And probably the way to answer this is to understand that diversity shouldn't be part of a company's marketing campaign or the way a company wants to show off its abilities and competencies. But instead, diversity is our society, our global society, right? When looking at Australia, it's kind of a mirror of how the world can look like when so many nations come together, for example, at UTS to study or to research. I mean, UTS is a public university that serves the public. If I just having listened to these wonderful stories about drones and about what can be done when the world really needs help, UTS not only serves our public society in Australia, but literally the global public society. This gets me back now to what the business school probably can contribute to this discussion, serving the public, and that pertains to your question, diversity, perhaps also gender equality, which is one of the UN SDG goals. It is number 5, if I'm not mistaken.
And part of your research.
And that was part of a study that, or in the wider sense, we picked up on this goal and applied it to the Australian context. And just pre-pandemic, there was a celebration happening in the press that in terms of women on Australian boards, and we picked the Australian context being here in Australia, that women on Australian boards had reached the 30% participation rate. And that was a massive party for some. Certainly the press was full of the achievement of finally having reached a 30% level of participation on ASX 200 boards. That means the largest 200 publicly traded companies. And provided that in principle in Australia, the nomination process is done by the incumbent directors, we felt maybe we should look at the social structures in this community of directors all across Australia, controlling basically in the cockpit of corporations these 200 companies. And so what we did is basically trying to understand how women that have now risen to 30%, what is the value of women's contributions? Because there are research pieces out there that say, for example, that women are fantastic risk managers compared to maybe male colleagues. And being married to a lawyer, I know that my wife is always a better risk manager than I am, so I'm agreeing to that at a personal level. But very importantly, we looked at basically at the sample of these company directors in Australia, and we wanted to understand what is the network power of women on Australian boards. And the reason why we want to look at network power and not simply at maybe simple statistics, that means participation rates, means over time in a time series, we felt like if women are allowed to come to the party, that means sitting on a board, that is one thing. But having actual influence on boards and perhaps being able to also influence the future of boards, that means, for example, allowing other new members coming into this community, that would be real network power, wouldn't it? And also on boards, there's of course several roles. What do these women do? Are they non-exec directors? Are there executive directors? Are there CEOs? Are there CFOs that probably call the shots, so to speak, on companies? And what we found is the following. So first of all, 30% is a great number. And of course, the research team and international team, also with support from the IT faculty, by the way, that was great. First of all, we have only unique contributors to the network are 25%. So we have actually 25% of women. Some of these have several seats on several boards. That by itself is okay, because of course some men also sit on several boards. But just to be clear about the participation of females on Australian boards. So that was just over 25% as opposed to the 30% overall seat number, which is a correct number. Okay. And then we looked at global and local power in a network. Allow me to explain that using very simple terms. Many of you perhaps have professional social networks. There are different brands out there, one in particular, and you have so many connections. Maybe some of you have 100 connections, maybe others have many thousand connections. I know, Tim, you're well connected on one social media site that I visited. So that means you have a direct relationship to each of your network members. That means you have some sort of a formal local power, because you can influence all these members technically, perhaps directly. But you also serve as a node between all these members in the social network. And if you're sitting on the direct path between two people, for example, the Prime Minister and perhaps the US President, I'm just making it up now as an example, then you have a piece of global power. I shall be correct here. And that means you potentially have influence through your connections and their connections on a much larger aspect of the network. And so measuring local and global power allowed us to really understand the contribution that women make, in particular the women that have newly joined the network, and what their role is in these networks. And what was interesting to see is, yes, the local networks expand. If a woman joins one or many boards, of course, the network within the board structure as a whole increases. But the global power, as measured in being connectors between other big players in the network, wasn't increasing. So in other words, there was a certain local power that perhaps increased for women, but not at a global level. That means perhaps being the deal maker behind the scenes. By contrast, Tim, and allow me to add this, there was a small amount of men, in particular men that have long-term board memberships and almost like an éminence grise behind the scenes, that have kind of a covert power as measured in global power. So to make a long story short, it appeared to be the case that, for example, the non-executive director positions that women had taken would lead to local network power in their boards, on their boards, across perhaps some boards that they were a part of, but not really across many meaningful boards that connects industries, sectors, the bigger companies.
Do you think to some extent the capacity to collaborate is important, say in business and law, but also in science, for instance, Willa?
Absolutely, and I think that capacity to enable that collaboration and bring all of the members of your diverse team, particularly women in science, into that team as equal collaborators is fundamental. It's also fundamental to innovation. So we know that diversity is not just a reportable metric, it's actually true that when you have more diversity, and particularly when you have more women genuinely enabled, is where you see that real shift in the culture. And so in science, here at UTS, we've been really committed very long term to shifting the gender equity within our faculty. And what we see, there's been a very long historical story about the pipeline. So if you get more girls interested in science, naturally it'll change. But that story's been around for 30 years and it hasn't changed at my level in science yet. And so it is about collaboration, it's about enabling, and it's about those interventions throughout the career. And so what I mean by that is when we measure and when we monitor gender equity in various science landscapes, unless we intervene, unless we put in place strategies to make it more inclusive, to increase collaboration, to support different ways of working, we don't actually really shift the gender equity. And so it's more than the percent representation, which is a little bit like the outline that Gerhard gave there about the enablement to engage. If we enable the women in the science sector to actually be as funded as well, to be supported as well, to work around their own personal choices and their lifestyle needs, their family needs or their career needs, we see greater innovation, we see greater engagement, and that's where we really need to continue to do that to make a difference to the global challenges that are ahead of us.
I was going to say that it's so fascinating hearing, issues around diversification and gender equality. The situation in law is slightly different to what Willa described in science. As currently, you might be surprised to hear that we have been having more female students in law than our male students. I've recently came across a set of data showing for young legal practitioners as solicitor in this country, in Australia, about 70% of the legal practitioner working as solicitor, they are female if we're talking about the group under 24 years of old. But if we're looking at the other end of the spectrum, the career progression, for legal practitioner as solicitor, if we're looking at the group 65 or above, we're talking about around 80% men. Very simply, we're losing our female colleagues as they progress in their career ladder. Why this is happening? There are a lot of reasons, a lot of theories behind it. But at the university level, we're trying everything we can to facilitate female lawyers. Either they want to go out into legal practice, or they want to take an alternative career, working as policy settings, or working as an in-house consultants. So we're trying to facilitate all our students, including our female students, which they are the majority currently, to develop the career of what they wish. But there are, difficulties on the way of doing that. Technology, we know in STEM, in those disciplines, women are probably, counted less than the male counterpart. And we know if we're speaking on leadership, 30% is great, 25% is great. But, if we have a deep dive into it, looking at the local impact and the global impact, that might tell you a different story. Here at ETS Law, for example, we tried to, and we're very successful in doing that. We were the first law school in Australia putting out legal tech major in our undergrad. So we offered legal and technology major in our Bachelor of Law program as the first law school in Australia. So this has been taken up by quite a number of law schools, across universities in Australia. And we also offered a range of career workshops to facilitate students to understand the real world that they will be competing with their peers beyond the university stage as well. So we're putting down quite a number of services, helping our student, female student and male student, to understand the environment that they will be operating in. So I think that's a very important and a very effective first step.
Now, Gerhard, do you think part of the issue with gender is holistically how we look at family and people having disruptions to their career to bring up young children? Should we look at it more holistically as a society and a family? And when you talk about jobs, you talk a lot about executives and being on boards and so on. A lot of women in underpaid jobs in aged care, nursing, that are caring, that are deliberately undervalued. Do you think that's part of the story, as well as trying to get more people on boards and so on?
Yes, I agree with you. There should be a holistic approach to support families by any means. And that of course means, at least in some families, perhaps the mother chooses to do some sort of day caring to start with perhaps. But luckily companies are catching up on serving, once again, society, serving people in society, add to their well-being. And that also means that, for example, men can take, and UTS is one of these employers that supports that kind of practice, where the men can also agree to have that leave of absence due to day caring duties. And I think that's wonderful. I think there are companies that do this better than others, and some companies may have not engaged at all in this, but it should be certainly a support that needs to be customized for families, because not all the families are the same. Some families have many children, some families have a support system. For example, myself and my wife, we came to Australia many years ago. We don't have any grandparents in the country for our children. So that made COVID especially exciting and challenging at the same time, of course, right? Spending time with your children is priceless, but it can be also challenging when you perhaps have a small house and you need to make sure nobody can go out because we have a pandemic going out. So I think, to answer your question, yes, I think we need a collaboration, and that means government, business and society has to pull really on the same string to get to these goals that make our lives better. I mean, if one puts it that way, if I think of technology, often we say, our life should be effortless, more effortless. In particular, fintech or edtech or insurtech or regtech people say, solving complex problems, if that becomes an easy task, then we made your life, the client's life, effortless. And of course, I like this positive language. But family life, as those of us who have family knows, can be an opportunity, a wonderful experience, and can at times be challenging when the circumstances outside of the family are not facilitating family life. And I'm a total supporter of facilitating family life, because sometimes I go to my students and I say, what do you care about? GDP, your paycheck, your iOS watch, what's important? I know that your phone has been important to you, but what's really important is being happy, isn't it? And if I ask people what makes you happy, it's their children, it's their family, other family members. That is ultimately the most important thing. So when we teach science, when we teach computer science, when we teach law to people, I think that needs to be also emphasized so that young future leaders are not losing that benchmark, that important compass in life. I know everybody has it. Everybody is wonderful because they made their mothers and fathers wonderful and happy. But I always tell students, don't forget that. When you go out and you solve the world's problems, you're actually adding maybe value to someone else. That feels good. It may not add to your paycheck immediately, but it feels good to help. And I think that's important. And UTS stands for these values, to help society, to serve society. And every single faculty I hear does this. So that's very exciting.
Thanks for watching this episode of Industry 5.0, where creativity meets technology. We hope that our discussion with our expert guests, Dr. Grace Lee, Professor Farouk Hussain, Professor Willa Houston, and Dr. Gerhard Hambusch, has provided you with valuable insights into the latest trends and developments in technology and its impact on our future. Stay tuned for more episodes where we explore the intersection of industry, creativity and sustainability in the era of Industry 5.0. Learn more about the University of Technology Sydney, Australia's #1 young university, located right here in the heart of Sydney's creative and innovation precinct, by visiting our website, linked below. I'm Tim Harcourt, I'm your moderator, I'm the Industry Professor at the University of Technology Sydney. Thank you.